When properly used, a circular polarizer can cut glare, increase saturation, and give you an effective 1 to 2 stops of increased dynamic range. But you can't just buy one, throw it on your camera, and forget it. There's a lot of quirks to using one, and today I want to give you some tips. Most of the effects can't be easily replicated in post-production, and if you use it incorrectly, it can really mess up your images. We're going to talk through what is a polarizer, what kind you should get, how to use it effectively, some mistakes to avoid, and I'll give you some practical tips at the end. My name is Mark Bergering. I'm a photographer and filmmaker, and I do practical gear reviews and photography tips here on YouTube. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. All right, so first up, what is a polarizer? It's a thread-on rotatable filter that cuts reflection from light. Now, one thing to be aware of when you're shopping for one is that almost all of them you'll find on the market are circular polarizers, which is what you want, but there are linear polarizers, which you will want to avoid. And when it comes to circular polarizers, it's not about the shape, it's about the type of polarization. So circular polarizers can sometimes be sold as rectangular filters that slide in as opposed to thread onto the front of your camera. Either way, once you have it on the front of your camera, it effectively blocks reflected light. Now that can be in the form of water, foliage or leaves, sky. It helps to cut glare on your images. All right, so next let's talk about what type you should get. There's tons of filters out there. There's cheap ones, expensive ones. You can get fancy magnetic ones like from Polar Pro, or you can get cheap ones on Amazon. They all do essentially the same thing, and it comes down to the user experience as the main differentiating factor. I tend to go for kind of a mid-grade filter because I often drop them. I'll stick them in my front pocket. They'll fall out, I'll lose them. I don't want to buy a super expensive one and then end up losing it, but I also don't want to buy a super cheap one and have kind of a funky user experience. Now, one tip when you're buying them is that you can get the largest filter for the largest lens that you have. For me, that's an 82mm filter, and then you can get step-up rings that adapt to all your other lenses. This is a way to save money, but it's also a little bit funky if you're trying to swap lenses quickly and you end up not using it because it's harder to change filters quickly, especially if you have the thread-on type. So what I end up doing is buying kind of a mid-grade filter, buying one for each size lens that I have, and that way when I'm quickly switching lenses, I can always have a circular polarizer on. So in terms of differentiators in the user experience, basically the higher quality filter you get, the less issues you're gonna have with flare and reduced contrast when it's in direct sunlight. Also, if you get some really cheap ones, they can get stuck on the front element of your lens, which is a real pain in the butt if you are out on a shoot. So if you're just getting started and you're gonna buy a cheap one, I also recommend getting a filter wrench so that when it gets stuck, you can take it off. All right, so next up, let's talk about how to use a polarizer. So first thing you need to know is that they're most effective when used 90 degrees from the sun. So the sun is directly there, and directly that way is 90 degrees. That's gonna be the most effective polarization and the most impact you'll see in your images. So if you're shooting directly into the sun, you're not gonna see an effect, or if you're shooting directly away from the sun, you're not gonna see an effect. They're also not really effective when it's cloudy, and you won't notice the impact as you rotate it. So as I mentioned, the main thing it does is cut glare on reflected light. So you're gonna see that when you look at reflections in plants, water, and the sky. The other thing to know is that it's a variable effect. So as you rotate that filter, you're gonna see how the effect changes. And there's no markings to indicate, where it's polarized and where it's not, because you need to look at each composition and see how it impacts that specific photo. The other thing to know is that you've got to adjust it each time. So if you're gonna take, say for example, a horizontal image, and then you're gonna rotate and take a vertical image, you're gonna have to rotate that filter correspondingly. I also highly recommend using a lens hood because, as I mentioned, if you buy a cheap filter, getting light on that front element will create flare, reduced contrast. So if you can keep light off of that front element, it will increase your image quality. Now, polarizers you can get for all types of cameras. I use one on my drone. You can get them for basically any type of camera, and I use them on almost all my cameras, but there's a few scenarios when I don't use them. So let's talk through that. Some mistakes to avoid. If you're just using a polarizer for darkening the sky, you'll notice that it can create dark spots. So if you're just using it for that, I recommend using Lightroom's AI Sky Select, and you can customize how that looks. This is especially an issue if you use really wide angle lenses and you use a polarizer. You're gonna notice that dark spot that happens in the sky, and that's not real easy to correct for. It's much easier to darken the sky with a selective AI tool. Secondly, you'll want to watch out for if you add thick filters on the front element of a wide angle lens, you might get vignetting at the widest angle. So say you have a 15 to 35 millimeter lens and you stack a thick filter on the front, you're going to get darkened edges on that image. Also, if your filter is dirty or scratched, you're definitely going to want to avoid shooting directly into the sun or directly at having light hit that front element, because you're going to get, as I mentioned, flare, kind of ghosting, reduced contrast, and issues with your image quality. Lastly, you're not going to want to use it in low light. So it reduces the light that hits your sensor by around 1 to 2 stops. So if you're trying to shoot in low light, it's going to reduce your exposure and force you to either increase your ISO or decrease your shutter speed, which can be a problem if you're shooting handheld. So just be aware that you'll want to make sure that you take it off once the sun goes down. So lastly, I wanted to end with 3 practical tips. First of which is get a filter case. So I have these 2, and basically you pop it open and it has a little storage spot for all of your filters, keeps them from getting scratched. My second tip is sometimes you might want just a little bit of polarization. So you don't have to turn it all the way with every image. You can just turn it a partial amount and get some polarization without the full effect. This is important if you're shooting wide angle images, to observe how it's affecting your image and make sure that you get the desired effect. You don't get a blob in the sky that's dark, or you don't get partial polarization and then the other part of the image has reflected light. And my last tip is that sometimes you do want the reflection. So you might be shooting a landscape image reflecting in a lake, and if you cut out all that reflection, you won't see that mirrored composition. And that can be really important to your image. So make sure that it's not reducing something in your image that you actually wanted to see. Thanks so much for watching. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And if you have any questions, leave a comment down below. I try to respond to all of those. Next up, I recommend you watch this playlist on how to shoot with a variety of different focal lengths. Check it out.